You see? These are the two contractors. There could be more. And now these parties have the contractual intent in their mind. You see? Contractual intent is something in the mind of the parties. You see? These parties intend the creation of a certain contract. So this is the contractual intent in their mind. Now, I think I explained to you. If not, you would have heard in the records of previous lectures that by contractual intent, we are not talking about the intention of creating a contract in the future. We mean the intent of creating the legal effects there and then. This is what we refer to as the contractual intent. It's not simply an idea. I am going to do such and such a thing. I'm going to create such and such a contract. We're not referring to the intention in general. We're talking of the specific, definitive intent of creating the legal effect. So this contract is hereby created, this intent in the mind. I am hereby creating this contract for achieving such and such rights and obligations as well as legal effects. So this is the contractual intent which is in the minds of the parties. Now, this intent is expressed by them in any acceptable mode. Next, we shall be talking about what are the modes through which this contractual intent can be given expression to. How can the contractual intent be expressed? So this is the expression of the parties, which can be in writing or in words or in certain other forms. So this intent is expressed by the parties. See? Early it was in the mind that this contract is being created, and this is expressed by both or all parties involved, and these two or more expressions, they can create the contract when they join together. If they can combine together. For this, there are conditions. What are the requirements for the expressions of multiple parties, two or more parties coming together, joining together in order to form a single contract? So in our definition of contract, we refer to these expressions, the offer, acceptance. They are coming together, which we refer to as the conjunction of the expressions or the conjunction of the offer and acceptance. Now this is the contract. All of these have, of course, details, general details, and also when we go to specific contract, they have specific details and specific requirements and conditions. So once those requirements and conditions are fulfilled, now these two expressions will not remain two expressions. They combine together to form a single contract, and this is only possible when all the relevant legal requirements are fulfilled. So this is what I try to indicate by putting this correct mark here, meaning that all necessary requirements are fulfilled. For instance, as we shall discuss next, this party is creating a contract where he is purchasing, let's say, car X. You see? But the expression of the other party refers to the sale of car Y. You see? So even when all other requirements are fulfilled, now there is a discrepancy in the expressions of the parties. That means they cannot combine together and join together to result in a single contract. So similarly, there are other requirements. So these are what you refer to as the in a legally identified manner, in a legally recognized manner in the definition. The requirements are fulfilled, then these two expressions will join together, come together to form a single contract. And what is the outcome of this formation of the contract? This results in the legal effect. Outcome of validly formed contract in Islamic law is that now these expressions give rise to an outcome, which is the legal effect. The legal effect is created through the conjunction of the offer and the acceptance. So this is the process through which the legal effect is created, which can pertain to the subject matter, and some pertain to the contractor's rights and obligations created. And far as the subject matter is concerned, the legal effects are reflected on it, such as, let's say, transfer of ownership. So all of this happens when these expressions come together in order to form a contract. Now, this is why we said that expression of contractual intent through offer and acceptance, fulfilling the relevant legal conditions, this is vital for the creation of the contract. But this expression is an expression of what? Expression of the contractual intent in the mind of the parties. So as I explained, by contractual intent, we mean that mental will of creating the contract. This contract is hereby formed. This is what you refer to as the contractual intent, not the intent or general idea of doing something at some point later. No, the mental command or the mental intent, I am hereby forming this contract, creating this contract in order to achieve these legal effects and rights and obligations. Now, that intent, when expressed and these expressions joined together, they form the contract when the requirements are fulfilled, and they result in the legal effect, which is principally reflected on the subject matter, and then also is reflected with regard to the rights and obligations pertaining to the parties. Well, now, I had briefly compared with the definition of contract in conventional laws. More details are there in the records you should have listened to by now. And then we talked of the tasarruf and iltizam, and then about the requirement of multiplicity of contractors, that the contract can result only when more than one party is actually involved in the creation of the contract, which means that if only a single party expresses the contractual intent, that does not result in a contract. This is the normal rule, and we explained the reason for this, which is that the rights and obligations are conflicting in nature, and therefore they cannot be adequately represented by a single party. Now, remember that it is because of this principle of multiplicity of contractors, that it is not possible for one person to act as the agent for both contractors. You see, one person may not act as the agent for both contractors. I hope that you're taking notes. If not, you're going to be in serious trouble later. So, because to make sense of what you find in the texts and your reference material, you having understood what I explained is vital. Well, so one person may not act as the agent for both or all contractors concerned. The sole reason is this: because multiplicity of contractors is a requirement in creating a contract. Let's say that a contract is created between parties A and B. It can be a contract of sale or any other contract. A and B are the contractors. So let's say party A appoints P as his agent. Let's say A is the seller and A appoints P as his agent. So now P represents A and creates the contract along with B. P is the agent of the seller and he creates a contract with whom? With party B, who is the buyer. P and B create the contract where P is an agent of the seller and B is the original contractor, the purchaser. They create the contract. Is it possible? Yes, possible. You see, as far as multiplicity of contract is concerned, there are two parties creating this contract, so it is possible. Let's say that party B, the buyer, he also is dealing through an agent. He appointed Q as his agent. The seller appointed P as his agent. The buyer B appointed Q as his agent.
So,
and now P, yes.
Q dengan B.
I can't hear you. Yeah, can you repeat? Who was talking? Is anyone asking anything or just simply the mic was on? Well, so now P and Q, the agents of A and B, they create the contract. P and Q create the contract. It is still possible. As far as we are talking from the perspective of multiplicity of contractors, it is still possible. Both of them are agents representing different contractors and they create the contract possible because two parties are involved in the creation of the contract. Now let's consider a third situation where the contractors, the seller and the buyer are A and B. Let's say that A appointed P as his agent to sell. A appointed P as his agent to sell. And B appointed, let's say that B, who is the buyer, I'll try to, is it A and B, sorry. Can you, can you see the screen?
No, sir.
No, sir.
No, sir.
No, sir.
Okay, wait.
So,
Well, let's say the contractors are A and B. A is a contractor. Sorry. Well, no problem. Let's forget about that. Now, A and B are the contractors. A appointed whom? Who can tell me? Whom did A appoint as his agent?
P.
P.
A appointed P as his agent for selling. P is the agent for sale. Let's say that party B, who is the buyer, he too wants to appoint an agent for purchase. Let's say that party B, the buyer, also appointed P as his agent to buy. The same person who was appointed as agent by the seller, he was appointed by the buyer too as an agent for purchase on his behalf. Now, party P has agency from both sides. P represents A, the seller, as the seller's agent, and he represents B, the buyer, as the buyer's agent. Now, does it mean that P himself can conclude this contract representing both parties, which means that he will sign for both A and B because he has the agency from both parties? Now, in Islamic law, this is not possible. Party P, who has a valid agency from the buyer to buy and the seller to sell, he cannot conclude this contract himself despite of his having a valid agency from both sides. The reason is that the principle of multiplicity of contractors is violated here. One person may not represent both sides of a contract despite of having a valid agency. So if he wants to act as agent for A, then he cannot use the agency for B. He has to act as the agent for the seller and directly deal with the buyer or any other agent of the buyer. If he wants to represent the buyer, then he cannot represent the seller as well. He has to deal directly with the seller or with any other agent appointed by the seller. So this is why I said that if you come across any situation in the future, so where you hear that the buyer concluded the contract himself, so remember that it is not valid in Islamic law. Well, so we explained that there is an exception here. In certain situations, one person may conclude the contract representing both sides in a very limited number of situations, such as a contract of sale concluded between a father and his minor child. So here the Sharia allows the father himself to conclude the contract, which although sale is a bilateral contract where multiplicity of contractors applies and two contractors should take part in the contract. But in this situation, the father is allowed to create the contract representing his minor son. He naturally, well, he represents himself, and he has, as the guardian, he can represent the son, and he can conclude the contract, and multiplicity of contractors will not a hindrance to the valid formation of this contract. So this we refer to as, what did we refer to this as?
Contracts by a single contractor.
Yes, contracts by a single contractor, and we meant bilateral, a normal contract that requires two contractors, two or more contractors. A normal bilateral or multilateral contracts created by a single contractor in exceptional situations, or where the requirement of multiplicity of contractors is overruled. Well, the other topic we discussed about was unilateral contracts, which is something totally different. I repeat this because some of us, they don't differentiate between contracts by a single contractor and unilateral contracts. Remember, in contracts by a single contractor, we are talking of normal contracts where there are two parties, two contractors. Only that, in exceptional situations, one contractor represents both. In what we call unilateral contracts, there is only one contractor. He does not represent any other part. He represents only himself. So, in fact, what we call unilateral contracts are statements resulting in legal effect. In fact, the word contract does not fit there because multiple parties don't take part in this contract. You see? So, the single person makes a statement that results in legal effect, and because of the statement resulting legal effect, we compare these with contracts, because usually contracts result in legal effect. So to differentiate these statements from normal contracts, we use the term unilateral contract to these, and I think I mentioned the endowment to waqf as an example, and ibra or discharge or writing of a debt as an example, where through the single statement made by a single party alone, the legal effect is created. The legal effect is created, and the other party too obtains his rights. And another example can be a guarantee. In Islamic law, guarantee is concluded by the guarantor alone. No endorsement necessary, no approval, acceptance, endorsement necessary from any other party. When the guarantor issues the guarantee that I am hereby guaranteeing settlement of the debt of so much due from B to A. This is a statement of guarantee. So once the statement is made, fulfilling the relevant conditions, now the contract of the guarantee is complete. You see? The creditor or the debtor need not accept it. Even without the acceptance, as far as the guarantee is concerned, the guarantee is legally valid and complete, which means the creditor has the right to demand from the guarantor the amount that he guaranteed with regard to the debt due from the stated debtor. Well, so that too can be an example for a unilateral contract. So who can tell me the similarity between unilateral contracts and a normal contract? On what basis is a unilateral contract called a contract?
They both result in legal effect.
Let me ask someone just to see whether Madam Adneen Imani, are you here from section 1?
Yes, sir.
Okay, tell me on what basis are unilateral contracts called contracts?
Because it has the legal effect.
Very good. Yes. The sole reason is that these single statements too result in legal effects similar to contracts. So by extension of the term contract, extension of the meaning of the term contract, the term contract is or aqd is used to refer to these unilateral statements as well. Well, now, so make sure that you go through the material and slightly let's say a better explanation can be found in the past records. I am not sure whether the unilateral contracts are found there or not. So go through the material because I am presenting the subject in a very brief manner. So you'll need much more details than this if you were to answer any question. Well, now let's move on to the essential elements for contracts. Essential elements for contracts. Now, before that, I would like to discuss the other term mentioned in our course outline, which is promise in Islamic law. Promise in Islamic law. Well, now promise is a term that is very much used in conventional law to the extent that contracts themselves as defined as promises, which is not the case at all in Islamic law. In Islamic law, there is very prominent distinction between promises and contracts. So never ever use the word promise in the context of contracts in Islamic law. Promises in Islamic law are not contracts, or code at least. You see, Aqd does not comprise of promises. Why? Because what does promises essentially mean? Promise means the expression of the intent to do something in the future. You see? Expression of intent to do something in the future. I will meet you tonight at such and such a place. You see? Or it is a normal promise. It can be contract rated as well. For instance, I will buy this car from you, let's say at such and such a price on such and such a date. There is a promise to create a contract of sale. So we explained in the beginning that creating the legal effect is aqd or contract in Islamic law. Those expressions, creating the legal effect, these are called aqd. You see, the aqd has to result in legal effect, and the process of creating legal effect is aqd in Islamic law. So mere undertaking or expressing the wish or will or intent to do something in the future, irrespective of whether it is a contract or not, this is a promise, but it is not a contract. You see? So aqd in Islamic law does not comprise of promises. Aqd in Islamic law comprises of definitive expressions of contractual intent of creating the legal effect. So understand this very well, write it down, underline it, so that you can avoid major pitfalls and mistakes in the future. Well, now, but our purpose is to discuss what is the significance of promise in Islamic law in the domain of contracts. How far are promises important in Islamic law in the domain of contracts? Promises are not contracts, or promises are not contractual statements. See, because promise come from one person. So even when two promises from two parties agree and are similar in nature and are about one and the same subject matter, it is not a contract or aqd in Islamic law. Well, so what is the significance of promise in Islamic law? So we can look at this from two angles. Do promises result in legal effect? That is one point. Do promises result in legal effect? And the second point is, are promises legally enforceable? You see? So let's discuss promise from these two angles. Promises, as I mentioned, are expressions of the wish or will to do something in the future. And as far as contractual promises are concerned, these are expressions of the will to create a contract in the future, or an undertaking to create a contract in the future is a promise or contractual promise. I will buy this car from you. I will sell this to you. I will give a guarantee. I will give a loan, you see, or I will, let's say, fulfill this task. You see, so this can be contractual promises, so promises mentioning a contract. Well, first of all, we shall try to understand whether promises result in legal effect or not. Well, we know that contract result in legal effect. I have hereby sold this laptop to you at this price. The other party to expresses that we are talking of the formal expression for creating a contract. If not, we shall discuss later that a contract can be created in other forms as well. So the other party says, I have hereby purchased this laptop from you at this price. Now the contract is created and the legal effects are realized. The ownership of the laptop changes hand from the seller to the buyer. Buyer is the owner now by virtue of this contract. He has already become the owner, and he comes under the obligation to pay the stated price to the seller as agreed. And the seller comes under the obligation of submitting the sold laptop to the buyer because the buyer has become the owner. You see? And so the ownership transfer takes place along with the contract. As soon as the contract is created, transfer of ownership takes place. The laptop does not remain the property of the seller anymore. It has become the property of the buyer now through the contract. The contract is a magical process through which this effect was realized. Ownership is now transferred to the other party in the Islamic sense, which means that the buyer has become the total owner, total and complete owner of the property sold. Well, and as far as risk and liability is concerned, risk and liability will not transfer along with the contract in Islamic law, as well as in most instances in conventional law also. A risk and liability transfer will take place along with the submission of the asset to the buyer. Once the buyer obtains possession of the goods purchased, at that point he will start to bear the risk and liability for the item. Well, so contracts result in legal effect. As far as promises are concerned, let's say that a person makes a promise, I will sell today on 21st of October 2020. Party A makes a promise to party B, I will sell this laptop to you at 2,000 ringgits on, when do you want to make this happen? Let's say on 1st of January 2021. I will sell this laptop to you for 2,000 ringgits on the 1st of January 2021. This is a promise. Promise to do what? Yes? Promise to
contract.
Promise to contract, promise to create a contract of sale, or promise to sell. Well, now this promise, will this promise result in any legal